Welcome to this week's edition of Good Books Radio. Audiobooks.com is the chief underwriter for Good Books Radio, which is produced by UTRGV Media Services for Rio Grande Valley Public Radio. And now, here's your host, Dr. W.F. Strong.
Welcome to Good Books Radio. I'm your guest host today, W.F. Strong, and I'm sitting in for Dr. John Cook, who is away on his honeymoon. Yes, that's right, he's on his honeymoon. By the time this airs, he will certainly be back, but he asked me to sit in just for old time's sake, and I'm happy to be here. We're going to be talking today to best-selling author of the book Drive, and To Sell is Human. We're going to talk to Daniel Pink about his new book, Win. Yeah, that's the name of it, Win, The Scientific Secrets of Perfect Timing. This is a new book that shows how timing affects everything, from work to home to school, and that it is a science, not an art. To be featured on the cover of the Wall Street Journal and the Washington Post, Wired, Men's Health, Harvard Business Review, etc., this book has to be spectacular to have that kind of prominence, and it is. I found it a great read. I found it inspirational. I found it potentially life-changing because, again, timing is everything. Here is a review from Publishers Weekly. It says, Pink should change many people's understanding of timing with this book, which provides insights from little-known scientific studies in a very accessible way. By the book's end, readers will be thinking much more carefully about how they divide up their days, how they organize their routines. Booklist says that this book is helpful, it is inspiring, and it is thoughtful. Kirkus Reviews says that it is solid science backed by sensible action points. So I think you'll find this book really wonderful, and I think you'll find the interview with Daniel Pink also illuminating. He's on the phone now, so let's talk to him. First of all, there's a book I read about some time ago. I think it's probably 25 years old, and the book was called Don't Buy a Car Made on Monday. You ever heard of that?
I have not heard of that. It's a funny title, though.
Yeah, it was. But the idea at the time was that, people coming to work on the line on Monday, hungover or tired, didn't do their best work on Monday. So you wanted to buy a car made on Wednesday or Thursday or something like that. In your book, you talk a lot about, the evolution of good work in the day, during the week, etc. So what do you have to say about that?
I have a definitive I don't know on that one.
Mm-hmm.
There is the effect of days of the week on our performance is a little bit. The evidence there is a tad murky.
Mm-hmm.
I do think that there. And also the car making process takes place over multiple days and multiple people, so I'd be a little bit skeptical of that one. What we do know is that people on Mondays are more likely to start positive behavior change. So we know that Mondays operate as what researchers call a fresh start date, where people are more likely to start going to the gym, more likely to begin a new diet, more likely to begin a new dedicated regime at work. So there are some virtues to Mondays.
Well, I think when this was written, of course, was when most of the work done on the line was done by people, not by robots.
Yeah, right. Actually, there are fewer people operating there. Yeah. And it's interesting. It's an interesting point. So one of the things that we know about the science of timing is that there are certain times of day where we're better at certain kinds of work. Mm-hmm. And so we move through the day in this period of, sort of stages of a peak, a trough, a recovery. And we're better off doing our analytic work during the mornings, typically during our peak, which is most people in the morning. And actually, if you look at what actually goes on the lines of auto plants now, a lot of the work is fairly analytic. You have fewer people with grease on their uniforms turning screws, and many more people who are programming computers.
What about for writers like you? Is it best in the morning?
It depends on what your chronotype is. Your chronotype is your propensity to wake up early and go to sleep early, or wake up late and go to sleep late. Writing is mostly analytic work, so for someone like me who is not a strong lark but a mild lark, my work, I get more writing. I always do my writing in the morning. In fact, this particular book, I probably wrote 90% of the words in this book before noon.
Before noon, okay. But
Yeah,
that's
yeah.
fairly common for writers. Aren't most writers kind of the 4 o'clock in the morning to noon? I mean, I've talked to a lot of writers, and that's very common.
Yeah, sure. No, it depends. I do think that is a fairly common pattern, and I think that a lot of writers have figured out these patterns of the day and how they can do better work. There's actually a really interesting book that I write about in my own book. It's a book called Daily Rituals, edited by a guy named Mason Curry, who looked at the work habits of artists, not only writers but visual artists, musicians, inventors. And we actually did for my book. We did an analysis of some of those schedules, and what we found is that about 2/3 of the people followed this kind of schedule, exactly as you're saying, where they do they do their main work in the morning. They take a little bit of a break in the afternoon, and then they kind of return to it in the late afternoon and early evening, and that seems to be a fairly common pattern for a lot of people doing that kind of heads down work.
Yes, actually, I was reading about Mark Twain recently, and he said that he wrote early in the morning, 5 to 9 or so, and then he would have breakfast, and then he would answer letters, and then in the afternoon he would come back to it and edit it, and then often
that's fairly common, and that's very consistent with what we know about the change in our performance over the span of a day. And the interesting thing about all of this is that it makes a huge difference. Research shows that time of day effects explain about 20% of the variance in human performance on these workplace tasks. So doing the right task at the right time can make a huge difference in our productivity and our creativity.
That's fascinating. Now, we're at the beginning of the year, and a lot of people, of course, as you note in the book, a lot of people, and everybody knows this, they select the first of the year to make great changes, to create a new you. And
yes, exactly.
And so we're at the point now at about the third week where people begin failing or noticing that they're not going to make it, right? So,
yeah.
So what do they need to do to get the timing right?
Well, there are some things. There's some things that we can do to essentially reboot, so that we have other chances to make a fresh start. And this is a phenomenon known as the fresh start effect. And what it shows is that all days of the year are not created equal. That there's some days where we're going to be more likely and more capable of starting a new regime, a new diet, a new exercise, something like that. And so certainly the big kahuna in all of that is New Year's Day. But there are other fresh start dates, plenty of them. Some of them are shared, so you're more likely to start a new regime on, say, the first of the month rather than the 13th of a month. Better off doing it on a Monday rather than on a Friday. But there are also personal dates, so do it on the day after your birthday rather than the day before. And what this allows us to do, what these fresh start dates allow us to do, is essentially, as I said, reboot. Another metaphor would be to think about a ledger. At the beginning of a quarter, at the beginning of a new year, businesses open up a fresh ledger. These fresh start dates allow us to open up, in a sense, a fresh ledger on ourselves, and that can actually change our performance pretty significantly.
Does it help to keep a ledger, so to speak, a journal?
That's an interesting, it's a great point. It's a great point. I think there is something to be said for observing our daily patterns. And actually in this book, I have a little worksheet that people can use to, write down how they're feeling at different times of the day and try to track their own patterns. As I said, this pattern of peak-trough recovery universally is pretty strong. It doesn't mean that my peak is going to occur exactly at the time of your peak or my trough at your trough. And so I think it's a very good point that if we're observant about our own behavior, our own mood, our own performance, we can make small tweaks to do things a little bit smarter and better.
I remember when I was in my late 20s and I was kind of on a multifaceted self-improvement plan, and I had this mantra for myself: the best I can be by decade 3. By the time I get
I
30,
like that.
by the time I get to be 30, I want to be able to, run 5 miles. I want to bench press 220. I had all these goals, and that was my mantra. The best I can be by decade 3.
And how did you fare on that?
Oh, I did great. Because I had a focus. I kept a journal about my achievement. Now, after I hit 30, I fell apart. But by the time I got there, I was doing well. No, I'm just kidding.
Yeah. Well, this reminds me of some other research I write in the book about marathons. The age at which people are most likely to run their first marathon is age 29, and it's for exactly that reason. Again, another temporal, time-based aspect of our lives that when we see a decade ending, it's more likely to energize us. So people are disproportionately likely to run their first marathon at ages 29, 39, 49, 59. 49-year-olds are 3 times likelier to run a first marathon than 50-year-olds.
I remember reading that, and that's what made me think of my own, decade 3 mantra, because I said, well, how interesting.
But you've got the rhyming thing going on, so that's huge.
Yeah, that's helpful. Yeah, you got to have it rhyme, and otherwise it doesn't have real power.
Yeah.
Now, here's another one that I thought of is, when it comes to romance, how many guys have been put off by a woman that they are carrying a torch for when she says, well, the timing's not right. I'm just not ready for a serious relationship right now. And so the timing always comes up in love and romance.
Yeah, and this is a trickier subject. There is some research on this, particularly about the age at which you get married and the likelihood of getting divorced. There's research out of the University of Utah showing that there is a kind of a sweet spot between the ages of about 25 and 32. That if you get married between that window, your odds of getting a divorce are slightly lower than at other times. So there's actually a big difference, believe it or not, between 24-year-olds and 25-year-olds. People who get married at 24 are 11% more likely to get a divorce than people who get married at 25. Now, that said, we're talking about the margins here. So, if you get married at age 34 or 44, it doesn't mean that your marriage is doomed.
Right.
But there seems to be something in that sweet spot of timing of marriage.
Oh, interesting. Well, I don't think I'll use it at the next wedding toast, but
well, yeah, especially if they're outside the window.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, so you guys are both 37 years old, which means statistically you have a slightly higher chance of divorce, but good luck.
Well, it could be fun. I was thinking of the old. I guess it's a kind of Spanish proverb that the perfect match for a man in terms of, again, timing is that you take the man's age, divide it by half, and add 7, and that's how old his bride should be. You ever heard that?
I haven't heard that one. I'm pretty skeptical of that one.
Well, let me just do it for you. So the 30-year-old guy with the 22-year-old girl is a good match, and because he's at a point in his life, a time when he has finally become mature in guy terms. And she's already there. She's already that mature, and so they're at a time when they're well matched. That's the thinking.
Yeah. I haven't seen any research on that. I'd be a little bit skeptical of that one. Although where it does have some science to it is when we look at chronotype and age, and what you find is that when we're really little kids are very morning oriented. They're larks. But when you get to about age 14,
tell me about
people become much more owly. Teenagers are, late chronotypes.
It's interesting, isn't
it? And then around age 24, we start to get larkier again on a slow path, for the rest of our lives. But it turns out that women are larkier than men, and women return to larkiness faster than men. So you often have couples who are the same age, where the man has a later chronotype than the heterosexual couples, where the man has a later chronotype than the woman. And what that means is that I'm the same age as my wife, and I usually go to sleep an hour later. And so if you marry, but on the other hand, because our chronotype changes over time, the compatible sleeping partners are where the man is actually a bit older than the woman. They end up being very much in sync in terms of their chronotypes and their sleeping time. So maybe that's where it came from.
Maybe so. It's a very old proverb. It's been around for centuries. So
yeah,
and of course it might have made sense 2 centuries ago. Things
right.
maybe have changed a bit. The here's another one that I wrote down just to bounce around a bit. This is from an author who said that what makes a book good is reading it at the right time in your life. And so, like, your book comes along for many people who are looking at the new year and the new diet that they're on or whatever, and how timing is important. And it comes along at a time when they can really pay attention to it and get the greatest good from it, perhaps.
Well, I like to think that about my own book. I think that's actually a lovely proverb, and I don't know research on it, but I've seen that many times in my own life where
Yes.
there's certain books where maybe I even try to read it, I start it, and I just don't get into it, and then literally like a couple years later pick it up, and it ends up being very meaningful to me.
Isn't that
So,
true?
yeah. So I think that's a very interesting. I think it's a very interesting phenomenon. I don't really have a good sense scientifically why that would be the case, but anecdotally in my own life, I've seen it many times.
Well,
There's also something to be said. This is I had a professor in college once who assigned us to read Huckleberry Finn, and everybody in every American high school student has read Huckleberry Finn. So here we are in college. We're thinking like, okay, we got to do some serious stuff, and he assigns Huckleberry Finn, and everybody goes, and he says something that has stuck with me to this day. He said, "You've read this book, but you haven't read this book." Meaning that you're a different person
Yes.
now than you were when you first read it, and your experience of reading this novel is going to be different because you have become a different person, even if it's only 4 or 5 years later.
Well, he might have gotten that from Twain himself, because Twain said that you should read every classic work 5 or 6 times in your life, because it'll always be a different book.
Oh, really?
Yes,
Interesting.
that's true. But I agree.
Yeah.
I agree with him. I agree with you, Twain. Wherever it comes from, it's absolutely true that it's a different book. And so a lot of our classic works, classic to us, we should reread. So the timing gives it its value.
Yes, absolutely.
Here's another saying I like. Comedy is tragedy plus time. I like that one. I like that one too. Again, on the science, I'm not so sure. Although there is some interesting research on how people perceive time, and one of the things that comes up in the research on nostalgia, which is looking at the past, awe, which has this effect of stopping us in time, is that while we'd like to talk about living in the present, it seems like the source of meaning in our lives, according to some very interesting research that I read about in the final chapter of the book, is our ability to integrate the present with the past with the future, the present with the future. That is, living in the present is, in sort of the Buddhist meditative way, can be helpful. Mindfulness and all that have very strong effects, but that the source of meaning comes from integrating the past, the present, and the future. And so this idea that comedy is tragedy plus time, to me, is actually akin to the integration of the past, present, and future that seems to be a source of deep meaning and purpose. Yeah, in my job as a college professor, I'm often trying to help students understand that this thing that seems so tragic right now, one day will be amusing to them.
Right. Sometimes, often, not always.
No, not always,
Yeah.
but sometimes the things that seem like a great tragedy now will be in the future amusing. And
Absolutely.
that doesn't always
Absolutely
solve
right.
the pain at this moment, but
Nope.
but I mean, I think of my own case of 7th grade. A girl. I had written her a beautiful love letter, and she,
Oh, boy.
and she tore it up in front of others.
Ouch.
And so it was a tragedy at the time, but now it's amusing. It's a funny thing that I cared that much.
Yeah.
They're in the study of chronemics. They often divide time into man's time and God's time. man's time obviously being the clock time, and God's time being nature's time, the tides, the seasons, etc. And a lot of people get stressed out because they're on man's time and living on man's time and living by the corporate time. Do you have any perspective on that? On how you adjust?
Different cultures have different approaches to time.
Mm-hmm.
And so Western cultures have very much a clock time focus, and other cultures have much more of a social time focus. So they're less punctual, they're less tied to what the clock on the wall says. And so I think it's interesting. I think what we're trying to do in all of our life is, in some ways, synchronize between what does the clock time say, what does the clock on the wall say, but what do other elements of time, what does cultural time tell us, what does, as you say, what does God's time tell us?
One of the things I like about the title of your book and your discussion of it is that too often we're not asking when, we're asking what and how and other things, where the magic question is when.
Absolutely right. What it shows is, and I think what's going on is that we take questions of what we do, who we do it with, how we do it very seriously, but we relegate these questions of when to secondary issues, and they're not. They're actually really important in our performance, in our happiness, in our health.
Is there anything in the research about, because college students worry about this, they talk to me about it a lot, and they'll say, I'm not sure that I should be in college right now. I'm not sure this is the time that I should be, doing this. And sometimes I'll say, given your attitude and your youthful spirit, I think it might be best for you just to take a backpack and hike around Europe for a year. That might be a better use of your time in this when you're 21 or 22.
I think there's something to that. I have a 21-year-old daughter, and her advisor in college has given her some. She's gotten great advice from a lot of mentors, and one of her major advisor, the head of the department that she's in, has advised her to. And I love this. It's like, do something you'll tell your grandchildren about.
Oh, that's good. That's good.
Yeah, that's a really good one. I think that's excellent. I wish someone had given me that advice.
That's good.
I guess I still have time. I don't have grandchildren, but
yes, you still have time. Well, one of my favorite personal sayings is something I say to everybody when they're going through some angst about things. I say the greatest tragedy in life is thinking it's too late.
Yes, I agree with that.
That people don't do things and think that, well, I'm too old for that, or it's too late for me to go to medical school. I'm 30, so it's over.
Right. No, that's preposterous. I mean, I might have thought that when I was 30. Looking at it now from the vantage point of my early 50s, I think that's insane.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yes, absolutely true. And another example of the point that you make earlier, that we are locked into perspective by our age and our time.
Right. Exactly.
See, when I was a young guy, about in my late 20s, I sold drugs legally in pharmaceuticals. And I remember asking when I was new to the business, I remember asking the regional manager, I said, what's the secret to being good at this? And he said, the secret is in having the right story for the right person at the right time.
Interesting, yeah. I think that's probably true.
And so in your studies of marketing and that sort of thing.
Yeah, well, I mean, it shows, there's some good research on decision making. And so a lot of times when the decision makers, they have a default decision, okay? So default decision in most cases is not to buy. Default decision is not to give you a raise. Default decision is not to contribute to your charity. Mm-hmm. And what the research shows is that decision makers, are somewhat more likely to overcome that default, to sort of change the default decision early in the day rather than later in the day, and after breaks rather than before breaks. So there's something to the actual timing of those kinds of things that is really, really significant.
A lot of your book focuses on how to make team timing better and more effective, and how to use timing to make people work in concert. more effectively.
Yes.
So
sure. There's some really good stuff on that about how do groups synchronize in time with each other? How do people synchronize in time with each other? And this is true for lunch deliverers. This is true for choirs. This is true for rowing teams. And and so if you unpack this, you begin to see some pretty strong effects or pretty consistent rules about how groups manage to synchronize in time. What I think is remarkable about this research on synchronization, and I'll use choral singing as an example of it. The research on choral singing is mind-blowing. Choral singing is about as good for us as exercise. Choral singing raises pain thresholds. It improves our immune response. It has a huge mood-boosting effect. It can be a prophylactic against depression. And this is not singing per se; it's singing in a group.
In a group, right?
And it also enhances our feelings of meaning, of purpose. It even synchronous activities of all kinds, including choirs, make us behave better. We're more likely to do a good deed. We're more likely to help somebody out. We're more likely to collaborate. We're more likely to be open to someone who doesn't look like us. And so there's something very powerful about synchronizing in time with other people. And there's a virtuous circle here, too, and that syncing with other people makes us feel good and do good. But feeling good and do good makes it easier for us to synchronize, which makes us better at synchronizing, which makes us feel good again and do good again. And so there's a virtuous circle of synchronization there. But I was really the one aspect of this book that really rocked me back on my heels is how powerful the effects are of singing in a choir. Something that really boggled my mind.
So, are you singing in a choir now?
I am not, but I would consider it. I would never consider that before. And now, if I can find a choir to take me, I would consider it.
Can you sing?
No.
But in a choir, you're...
I figure everybody else will drown out my bad voice.
That's right. Your weaknesses get covered. Yes, that's right.
Yeah.
Well, listen, I know you have another interview to get to. Timing is everything. So I want to thank you so much for giving us your time to talk about this. I had read your book Drive, and I saw this come across my desk, and I said, I have to talk to him.
All right, fantastic. Well, I'm glad you did, Bill. I enjoyed the conversation.
It's been my great honor. We've been talking today with Daniel H. Pink about his book, Win, The Scientific Secrets of Perfect Timing. As you can see, he is a kind of inspirational speaker. He's been on TED Talks many, many times. And this book, as I pointed out, has been very, very powerfully and wonderfully reviewed by all the usual major sources. Again, Publishers Weekly said that this book is like discovering your favorite professor in a box. It is a frothy blend of utility and entertainment, says Bloomberg, and it is radical, it is surprising, and it is undeniably true, says Forbes. I'm W.F. Strong signing off for Good Books Radio. As always, I'm hoping that all your books are good reads.